Of every skill a person can build in a lifetime, there is one that quietly determines the ceiling on almost everything else you will ever accomplish. Not intelligence, not talent, not even discipline, though discipline comes close. It is the ability to actually communicate clearly and convincingly with another human being. Think about it honestly for a moment. The best idea in the world, poorly explained, changes nothing. A mediocre idea, explained with real clarity and conviction, moves people to act. The gap between those two outcomes is not the quality of the idea. It is the quality of the communication carrying it. Today I want to give you 7 pillars of communication that actually matter, stripped of the fluff, the kind you can start applying in your very next conversation. Not vague advice like speak clearly or make eye contact. Real, specific shifts that change how people receive what you say. Stay with me for the next 25 minutes because this single skill, more than almost any other, tends to compound quietly over an entire career and an entire life. One more thing worth saying before we start. Communication is not a fixed trait some people are simply born with and others are not. It is closer to a craft, built the same way any craft is built, through deliberate attention and repeated practice, not through some natural gift you either have or lack. Everything in the next 25 minutes is learnable, regardless of how you would currently rate your own ability to explain yourself clearly to another person. So let's start with the first pillar. Have something worth saying. This sounds almost too obvious to mention, and yet it is the single most skipped step in the entire subject of communication. People spend enormous energy on delivery, on tone, on confidence, while completely neglecting the substance underneath all of it. Here is the uncomfortable truth. Polished delivery of an empty message is still an empty message. It might sound impressive for 30 seconds, but it leaves nothing behind. The people whose words actually stick with you, sometimes for years, are almost never the smoothest talkers in the room. They are the ones who had something real to say, built from real experience, and simply said it plainly. So where does having something worth saying actually come from? It comes from paying attention to your own life as it happens, instead of letting it pass by unexamined. Every mistake you survive, every small win you earn, every hard conversation you get through is raw material. Most people let all of that evaporate, unrecorded and unreflected on, and then wonder why they feel like they have nothing interesting to say. A simple habit fixes this. Keep a running record, even a rough one, of what you are learning as you go. Not for publication, just for yourself. 6 months of that habit gives you more genuine material to draw on in conversation than most people accumulate in 6 years, simply because you actually captured it instead of letting it slip by. There is also a quieter form of this worth naming. Having something worth saying is not just about stockpiling stories. It is about actually forming a real opinion about the things you talk about instead of just repeating whatever you last heard. People can feel the difference between someone relaying secondhand talking points and someone speaking from something they have actually thought through themselves. The second version is far rarer, and it is exactly why it lands so much harder. Consider 2 people describing the exact same setback in their business. The first says, "It just didn't work out, the market wasn't right." The second says, "Here is specifically what I misjudged. Here is the moment I noticed it, and here is what I would do differently next time." Both experienced the same failure. Only one of them actually processed it into something worth telling another person. That processing step, uncomfortable as it is what turns a raw experience into genuine substance instead of just a vague anecdote. It is worth being honest that this requires a form of discipline most people avoid, because reflecting honestly on your own mistakes and successes is genuinely uncomfortable. It is far easier to let an experience blur into a general feeling, good or bad, than to sit with it long enough to extract the specific transferable lesson buried inside it. The people who become genuinely compelling communicators are, almost without exception, the people willing to do this uncomfortable extraction work consistently, long after everyone else has simply moved on and forgotten the details. Now here is the second pillar. Understand the room before you try to move it. Here is a mistake almost everyone makes at some point, usually more than once. They walk into a conversation, a meeting, or a presentation with exactly the message they plan to deliver, and they deliver it regardless of who is actually in front of them. The problem is that the same message lands completely differently depending on who is receiving it, what they already believe, what they are worried about, and what they actually need from the conversation. A message perfectly tailored for one audience can fall completely flat or even backfire with a different one. Skilled communicators read the room first and only then decide how to deliver what they came to say. This does not mean changing your actual message to please people. It means changing the entry point, the language, and the examples you use to reach them, while the core truth you are delivering stays exactly the same. A concept explained to a room of engineers should sound different from the same concept explained to a room of new employees on their first day, even though the underlying idea has not changed at all. One practical way to build this skill. Before any important conversation, spend 60 seconds asking yourself what the other person actually cares about right now, not what you assume they should care about. That small shift, done consistently, changes how persuasive you are far more than any amount of practicing your own delivery in the mirror. This becomes especially important when you are trying to get a group of very different people moving in the same direction. Anyone who has managed a team knows this challenge well. Different personalities respond to completely different kinds of language. Some people need the big picture first. Some people need the specific next step first, and the big picture later. A communicator who only has one setting will only ever reach the portion of the room built for that setting and lose everyone else. There is a particular version of this challenge that deserves its own mention, which is communicating with people who are highly independent and resistant to simply following instructions. Getting a room full of naturally compliant people to move together is straightforward. Getting a room full of strong-willed, independent thinkers to move together without anyone feeling steamrolled is an entirely different and far more valuable skill. It usually requires giving people a genuine reason rooted in their own interests, rather than simply issuing a directive and hoping compliance follows out of habit, one quiet lesson worth carrying with you. The people who most need to hear a particular piece of feedback are frequently the ones least willing to actually absorb it in the moment, and there is rarely a clean explanation for exactly why. Rather than treating this as a personal failure of your delivery every time it happens, it is often more useful to simply recognize the pattern, adjust your approach where you reasonably can, and accept that not every message lands on the timeline you would prefer, no matter how skillfully it is delivered. The third pillar is this: say it so people can actually picture it. There is a specific kind of communication that does something almost nobody can quite explain, and everybody instantly recognizes when they hear it. It takes an abstract idea and makes it visible, almost like the listener can suddenly see the thing being described. Compare two ways of saying the same thing. Our revenue declined due to reduced customer engagement in the second quarter, versus customers started walking past us in the second quarter, and we didn't notice until they were already gone. Both sentences describe the same fact. Only one of them actually creates a picture in your mind, and pictures are what people remember, discuss, and act on. Numbers alone rarely move anyone. Pictures move almost everyone. This is a learnable skill, not a rare gift some people are born with and others simply lack. It starts with a habit. Whenever you are about to explain something abstract, pause and ask yourself what it would actually look like if someone could watch it happen. Then describe that, instead of describing the abstraction. Concepts become memorable the moment they become visible. There is a specific expression worth noticing whenever you hear it in conversation, because it is a strong signal that real communication just happened. Someone says, "Oh, now I get it," or "that makes so much sense now," with a shift in their tone, almost like something visibly clicked into place for them. That moment is the entire goal of this pillar. You are not just transferring information. You are creating the specific moment where confusion turns into clarity, right in front of you, This also explains why a single, well-chosen comparison often does more work than an entire page of explanation. The human mind understands new things by relating them to things it already understands. A skilled communicator constantly hunts for that bridge. The familiar thing that makes the unfamiliar thing suddenly make sense, instead of simply repeating the unfamiliar thing louder or in more technical language, there is a specific discipline behind building this skill, and it starts with noticing your own explanations as you give them. Whenever you catch yourself using an abstract term, a percentage, or a piece of jargon, pause internally and ask what that thing would actually look like if you could point at it. Practicing this repeatedly, even silently in your own head during ordinary conversations, gradually rewires the way you explain things by default, until reaching for a picture instead of an abstraction becomes automatic rather than effortful. It is worth noting that this skill matters just as much, if not more, in writing as it does in speech. A written explanation loaded with abstractions is just as forgettable as a spoken one, and the same fix applies. Wherever a sentence would normally rely on a category, a metric, or a technical label, look for the single concrete image that could stand in its place instead, and your writing will start landing with the same force as your best spoken explanation. Fourth pillar. Bring a little lightness into serious moments. This one gets underestimated constantly, especially by people who take their subject matter seriously, which is understandable, but often counterproductive. A small, well-placed moment of wit does something that pure seriousness never can. It disarms tension, and a disarmed audience listens far more openly than a defensive one. This does not mean turning every serious conversation into a comedy routine. It means being willing, at the right moment, to lighten a heavy exchange just enough that people relax without losing the thread of what actually matters. A tense negotiation, a difficult piece of feedback, a stressful meeting, all of these tend to go better when the person leading them can find one honest, well-timed moment of humor without derailing the substance. There is also a defensive version of this skill worth knowing. When someone challenges you with a comment that is more provocation than genuine question, matching their tone with equal seriousness often escalates things unnecessarily. A calm, lightly witty response frequently diffuses the moment far better than a defensive, overly serious one ever could, because it signals confidence rather than threat. The people who use this well are not naturally funnier than everyone else. They have simply given themselves permission to not take every single moment with maximum gravity, and that permission alone changes how a room receives them. Nobody enjoys spending time around someone who treats every sentence like a courtroom testimony. A little lightness, used sparingly and at the right moment, makes people want to keep listening. There is an important boundary worth naming here because this pillar is easy to misuse. Lightness works when it respects the actual weight of the situation, and it fails badly when it dismisses it. Making a joke to ease tension in a difficult conversation is different from making a joke that trivializes the other person's genuine concern, and the gap between those two things is usually obvious to everyone in the room except the person who crossed it. The skill is not simply being willing to joke. It is sensing precisely how much lightness a given moment can actually absorb before it starts to feel careless. Fifth pillar. And this one is the quiet multiplier underneath all the others. Actually care whether the other person understood you. Most communication failures are not failures of vocabulary or delivery. They are failures of genuinely checking whether the message actually landed. Here is a simple but revealing test. After explaining something important, do you move on immediately, assuming it was understood, or do you pause and actually check? Most people move on immediately because checking feels like it might slow things down or imply the listener wasn't following closely enough. But that small pause, done with genuine curiosity rather than condescension, catches an enormous number of misunderstandings before they turn into real problems. This pillar also shows up as sensitivity to timing. The exact same message, delivered on someone's best day versus their worst day, lands completely differently, and skilled communicators notice which kind of day it is before choosing how directly to speak. This is not about walking on eggshells. It is about recognizing that communication is not just about the words leaving your mouth. It is about what actually arrives in the other person's mind, and that depends heavily on the state they are in when it arrives. There is a version of communication that is technically accurate but completely uncaring, and people can feel the difference immediately, often without being able to articulate why. The words might be correct, the logic might be sound, but if the other person senses that you do not actually care whether they understood or how they feel about it, something in the exchange falls flat. The version of communication people remember, trust, and return to again and again is the version where they can tell, unmistakably, that the person speaking actually cared whether they understood. This pillar is also the hardest one to fake convincingly, which is exactly why it matters so much. People are remarkably good at sensing genuine care versus performed care, even when they cannot immediately name what tipped them off. A technique borrowed from someone else, delivered without real investment in the listener, tends to feel hollow in a way that is hard to hide. The only reliable fix is not a better technique at all. It is actually caring, consistently, about whether the person across from you leaves the conversation better off than they entered it. Sixth pillar. Listen like the conversation actually matters. Almost everything discussed so far has focused on how you speak. This one flips the direction entirely, because the quality of your listening quietly determines the quality of everything you eventually say back. Most people, in most conversations, are not actually listening. They are waiting for their turn to speak, half formulating their response while the other person is still talking. This is easy to spot from the outside, and surprisingly common once you start paying attention to it in yourself. The tell is simple. If you can predict your own response before the other person has finished their sentence, you have likely stopped listening several sentences earlier. Real listening changes what you are able to say afterward. It surfaces the actual concern underneath the stated one, the specific word someone keeps repeating, that reveals what they truly care about, the hesitation right before an important point that tells you more than the point itself. None of that is available to someone who is simply waiting for a gap to jump into with their prepared response. A practical way to build this. In your next few important conversations, deliberately delay your response by one full beat longer than feels natural, and use that beat to actually consider what was just said rather than to polish what you were already planning to say. This small pause, uncomfortable at first, tends to noticeably improve the quality and relevance of what you say next, because it is actually responding to the conversation instead of simply continuing a monologue you had already prepared in your head. And here is the seventh and final pillar. Say less than you are tempted to. This one runs against a very common instinct, which is the urge to keep talking once you have made your point, adding qualifiers, extra examples, and reassurances that usually weaken the message rather than strengthen it. There is a particular kind of confidence that shows up as restraint. Saying exactly what needs to be said, and then deliberately stopping, communicates a level of conviction that over-explaining quietly undermines. The person who makes their point once, clearly, and then holds silence, is almost always read as more credible than the person who repeats the same point 4 different ways out of nervousness that the first version didn't land. This restraint is especially valuable in moments of disagreement or difficult feedback. Adding excessive cushioning language, apologizing repeatedly for a reasonable request, or continuing to explain long after the point has been made, all tend to dilute the message and invite the other person to negotiate around it. A short, clear, respectfully delivered statement, followed by comfortable silence, tends to land with far more weight than the same message wrapped in 5 extra minutes of softening. Learning to say less is, in a strange way, one of the more advanced communication skills on this entire list, because it requires tolerating a kind of discomfort most people instinctively avoid, the discomfort of silence after an important sentence. Sit in it anyway. That silence is frequently doing more communicative work than anything you could add to it. So let's bring all 7 of these together. Have something worth saying, built from genuine attention to your own experience, not second-hand talking points repeated without real thought behind them. Understand the room before you try to move it, adjusting your entry point without ever compromising your actual message. Say it so people can picture it, because abstractions fade and pictures stick. Bring a little lightness into serious moments, because a disarmed audience listens far more openly than a defensive one. Genuinely care whether the other person understood you, because that care is what separates communication people from communication people carry with them for years. Listen like the conversation actually matters, because your best responses come from what you actually hear, not from what you were already planning to say. And say less than you are tempted to, because restraint, used well, often communicates more conviction than any amount of extra explaining ever could. None of these 7 pillars require natural charisma or an especially large vocabulary. They require attention, practice, and a genuine investment in the person on the other side of the conversation, which is available to absolutely anyone willing to build it. Every relationship you will ever build, every opportunity you will ever earn, and every idea you will ever get someone else to actually act on runs through this one skill. It is worth treating it with the seriousness it deserves, not as a soft skill on the side, but as one of the central skills your entire life quietly depends on. You do not need 25 more years to start improving at this. You need your very next conversation, approached with a little more intention than the one before it. If you want a simple way to start, pick just one of these 7 pillars, the one that feels most relevant to a conversation you already have coming up, and apply it deliberately, just once before this week ends. Notice what changes. Then pick the next one the following week. Trying to install all 7 at once tends to overwhelm and fade within days. Building them one at a time deliberately is how they actually become permanent, instead of just another idea you agreed with while watching a video and then forgot by the following afternoon.